This is always an interesting week on the annual national calendar, encased as this week is by Holocaust Memorial Day on one hand and on the other by Independence Day, preceded by Memorial Day for Israel's fallen in battle. It's very much a time for national reflection on existential issues. A suitable time for reflecting on this question. What in the eyes of Israelis is the greatest guarantee of the existence of their state? Is it international legitimacy? Reliance on the biblical heritage? Peace and recognized boundaries, perhaps? The country's renowned military prowess and doctrine of military preemption? Or the ambiguity inherent in Israel's assumed nuclear capability? All these are indeed important ingredients, maintains conservative Jerusalem ideologue and political scientist Professor Jerrold, who some years ago won recognition internationally for a seminal work called Crazy States. All are important, but Dror once put it cogently to me, there is another factor that supersedes all of them. He put it this way. It's that the world knows that if ever Israel felt that its survival was threatened, Israel would not hesitate to do what it takes to ensure its survival. In other words, his argument was that the world understands that if Israel were to have nuclear capability, it would be ready to use it if it ever were to feel that its existence was really in jeopardy. There is another dimension to this Israeli mindset which the world has come to understand. It's what the Holocaust means to Israelis. Prominent in the Israeli psyche is what acting Prime Minister Ehud Olmert reiterated at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial as the 6 million were being remembered, that Israel's prime purpose is to ensure that it will not happen again. This adds another dimension to the world's knowledge, the understanding that Israel knows that the world did not act to stop the Nazi killing machine. Thus, it was most pertinent that on Holocaust Memorial Day, Olmert and other Israeli leaders made a point of referring directly to the position enunciated time and again during recent months by Iran's President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Both his denying of the Holocaust and his insistence on the need for Israel to be eliminated. The arguments of the Iranian president, which form the backdrop to his country's own ongoing international battle to win legitimacy for its independent nuclear program. It's an issue that keeps bubbling. In the past week alone, there were the following developments. Iran continued to cock a snoot at United Nations diplomatic efforts to rein in those nuclear aspirations. Israel, for its part, launched an upgraded high-resolution reconnaissance spy satellite, the Eros-B, which will enable Israeli intelligence to monitor Iranian nuclear sites. The head of the Israeli Army's intelligence branch revealed that Iran had purchased North Korean ballistic missiles with a range of 2,500 kilometers, which upgrades its reach not only to Israel but to Western Europe. And a high-level strategic committee charged with defining Israel's strategic challenges of the next decade presented its conclusions that other Middle Eastern countries could be tempted to follow Iran in trying to equip themselves with nuclear weapons as self-defense. Another key point released from that report, a report incidentally officially designated top secret, recommended that Israel should maintain its long-standing strategy of nuclear ambiguity. More of the policy of ambiguity in a moment. But first, something which Israeli historian Tom Segev wrote this week about the Holocaust becoming more and more part of global consciousness as the incarnation of evil. The world knows, said Segev, that Auschwitz gave birth to Dimona, Israel's nuclear center. And Segev went on, and the world accepts it, at least quietly. Against that new global reality, it's hardly surprising that the Iranian president has doubled international concern about his country's nuclear program. Willingly or unintentionally, he has created an identification of purpose between his tirades against Israel and denial of the Holocaust. That, in turn, allows Israel to maintain an ambiguous stance, both with regard to what it believes need to be done vis-à-vis Iran and on its own nuclear capability. Iran's national nuclear ambitions are certainly an element in ongoing strategic discussions between Israel and the United States and other international powers. But Israel believes it can afford an ambiguous stance towards Iran, to prefer diplomacy to be exhausted and thus on the question of how to curb Iran, even to sound less adamant than the Bush administration. In the same way that Israel states that it will never be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the region, so too it indicates it won't be the first to confront Iran. But there's more to why Israel feels it can stay on the sidelines of the international campaign to contain Iranian nuclear development. In part, it is indeed because, for now, this is a global issue, not an Israeli issue. But it's also because Israel believes that the world believes that Israel will not sit on the sidelines if those international efforts to curb Iran prove fruitless.